Nalita was a gentle soul, the kind of girl who carried warmth in her smile and kindness in her heart. She had a happy childhood, filled with love and care from her mother. But fate can be cruel. When Nalita was just a little girl, her mother fell ill and passed away, leaving her in the hands of her father, Chief Tabo. He was a respected man, known for his wisdom, but even the wisest of men can make grave mistakes. Loneliness crept into Chief Tabo's life, and soon he remarried. His new wife, Fadima, entered their home with sweet words and a charming smile, but beneath the surface, she was a woman with a heart of stone. She did not come for love, she came for control. The moment she stepped into the household, she saw Nalita as a problem, a barrier standing between her and the wealth she desired. At first, Fadima pretended to care for the young girl. She spoke softly, stroked Nalita's hair, and pretended to be the mother she had lost. But her kindness was nothing more than an act. When Chief Tabo was around, she played the role of a loving stepmother. But the moment his back was turned, her mask slipped. She gave Nalita the smallest portions of food, forced her to do chores meant for servants, and made sure she was always too tired to smile. Nalita, though young, felt the shift in her world. She noticed how her father, blinded by love, could not see the truth about his new wife. She knew that no matter how hard she tried, she could never make Fadima love her. But what she didn't know was that Fadima's hatred for her was growing into something even more dangerous. Fadima was not a woman who settled for small victories. She wanted total control over Chief Tabo's wealth, and Nalita was a threat. As long as the girl was in the house, there was always a chance that Tabo's love for his daughter would make him cautious about handing everything over to his new wife. Fadima needed a plan, one that would ensure Nalita was removed from the picture forever. And so, behind closed doors, she began to scheme. Chief Tabo's health began to decline, and with each passing day, his strength faded. He was no longer the powerful man he once was. He spent most of his time in bed, coughing weakly, his voice barely more than a whisper. The village healers tried their best, but nothing seemed to work. Fadima pretended to care, acting like a devoted wife, but in her heart, she rejoiced. With Tabo weak and bedridden, she could finally do whatever she wanted. She knew she had to act fast. If Tabo recovered, he might start questioning things, and she couldn't risk that. Nalita was still in the house, still a threat to her plans. She had to get rid of the girl once and for all. But Fadima was not one to get her hands dirty. She needed someone else to do the job for her. One evening, as Chief Tabo slept in his chamber, Fadima met with a wealthy merchant named Bwana. He was a man known for his riches, but behind his wealth was a dark reputation. People whispered about how he treated those who worked for him, like animals, like property. But Fadima didn't care about that. All she cared about was getting Nalita out of her way. "I have a girl for you," she told Bwana, her voice low and secretive. "She's young, strong, and obedient." Bwana narrowed his eyes, studying her. "And why would a stepmother want to sell her own daughter?" Fadima smirked. "She's not my daughter. She's a burden." That was all Bwana needed to hear. He agreed to take Nalita in exchange for a heavy bag of gold. That night, Fadima went home and packed a small bundle of Nalita's clothes. She woke the girl up before dawn, shaking her roughly. "Get up," she hissed. "You're leaving." Nalita, still half asleep, rubbed her eyes. "Leaving? But where?" Before she could finish, Fadima grabbed her by the wrist and dragged her outside. A carriage was waiting, and inside it sat Bwana, his dark eyes scanning her like she was nothing more than an item he had just purchased. "Stepmother, where are we going?" Nalita asked, panic creeping into her voice. "You'll be staying with a rich man now," Fadima said coldly. "You should be grateful." Nalita's heart pounded as Fadima shoved her toward the carriage. She tried to resist, but Bwana's strong hands pulled her inside, slamming the door shut. The last thing she saw was Fadima's satisfied smile as the horses began to move. The journey was long and rough. Every bump in the road made Nalita's fear grow. She had no idea where she was being taken, but she could feel in her bones that it wasn't anywhere good. When they arrived at Bwana's grand estate, Nalita's worst fears came true. The house was massive, but there was no warmth in it. The servants didn't smile, their faces filled with exhaustion and misery. And soon, Nalita realized why. Because she was now one of them. Bwana didn't treat her like a guest, nor even like a person. She was ordered around like a slave, forced to do endless chores from sunrise to sunset. If she was too slow, she was beaten. If she complained, she was punished. She was given food only when Bwana felt like it, and even then, it was never enough. Every night, Nalita curled up on the cold stone floor, her body aching, her stomach empty. She thought of her father, wondering if he even knew what had happened to her. She thought of her mother, wishing she were still alive. But most of all, she thought of Fadima, the woman who had betrayed her, sold her like an object, and thrown her into a nightmare she couldn't escape. Nalita's days were filled with endless suffering, and her nights were even worse. She barely slept, afraid of what would happen if she let her guard down. Every morning, before the sun had even risen, she was up, scrubbing floors, carrying heavy loads, and serving Bwana without rest. Her hands were covered in blisters, her feet bruised from walking barefoot on the hard stone floors. She had no one to talk to, no one to comfort her. She was trapped in a life she never asked for, but deep inside her, a fire still burned. She refused to accept this as her fate. She knew that if she stayed, she would never be free. She had to find a way out, no matter the cost. One night, as the house fell silent and Bwana's loud snores echoed through the halls, Nalita saw her chance. The gates were always locked and guards patrolled the estate. But that night, the rain poured heavily, making it hard for anyone to see or hear properly. She had been watching, waiting for the right moment, and now it had finally come. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tiptoed through the dark corridors. She moved quickly, her breath shallow, her hands trembling. Every sound made her freeze, every shadow made her panic. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. Reaching the back of the estate, she found a small wooden shed that stored tools. She had seen Bwana's men use it before, but they always left it unlocked. She pushed the door open and slipped inside. Her fingers fumbled in the dark as she searched for something, anything that could help her escape. Then she found it, a rusted iron rod. Holding her breath, she hurried to the tall gates at the back of the estate. They were chained, but the rain had weakened the old metal. She shoved the iron rod between the chains and twisted with all her strength. The links groaned, then snapped apart. The gates creaked open just enough for her to slip through. She didn't look back. She ran, barefoot, soaked in rain, and shaking from fear. She ran as fast as she could. The cold night air stung her skin, but she didn't stop. She ran past trees, through muddy paths, across fields. She didn't know where she was going. All she knew was that she had to get as far away as possible. Hours passed, and her legs burned, but she pushed forward. Then, just as her strength was about to give out, she saw a flickering light in the distance. A small hut stood in the middle of an open field, smoke rising from its chimney. Desperate and exhausted, she staggered toward it. The door creaked open, and an elderly man stepped out, holding a lantern. His eyes, though old and wise, were kind. He took one look at Nalita, her torn clothes, her bruised body, her desperate expression, and without a word, he stepped aside and let her in. Inside, the warmth of the fire wrapped around her like a blanket. She collapsed onto the floor, unable to hold herself up any longer. The old man knelt beside her, gently covering her with a cloth. "You are safe now, child," he said softly. "Rest." His name was Elder Mzinga, and he was unlike anyone Nalita had ever met. He didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations. He simply took care of her, feeding her, tending to her wounds, and giving her a place to stay. For the first time in years, Nalita felt hope. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing. She was no longer a slave. She was free. And with Elder Mzinga's help, she would rebuild her life, no matter what it took. Nalita had spent years being treated like she was worthless. But Elder Mzinga saw something in her that no one else had. He saw strength. He saw resilience. And most importantly, he saw potential. From the moment she stepped into his home, he treated her with kindness, but he also challenged her. He did not pity her or treat her like a broken girl who needed saving. Instead, he taught her. He believed that knowledge was the most powerful weapon, and he was determined to arm her with it. Each morning, before the sun fully rose, Nalita sat by his side as he worked. Elder Mzinga was not just a kind old man. He was a master of trade, a man respected by merchants far and wide. He knew the secrets of the market, the art of negotiation, and the power of understanding people, and he shared everything with Nalita. At first, she struggled. Numbers confused her, and bargaining felt intimidating. But Nalita had already survived the worst life had to offer. If she could endure cruelty, betrayal, and servitude, then she could learn business. So she listened, she observed, and she practiced. She watched how Elder Mazinga spoke to traders, how he made deals, how he turned small profits into great wealth. Then one day, he handed her a small bag of goods, dried spices, beads, and hand-woven cloth. "Go," he told her. "Sell these at the market. Let's see what you've learned." Nalita's hands trembled as she took the bag. The marketplace was filled with loud voices, the smell of roasted meat, and the sound of coins clinking. She walked through the busy stalls, her heart racing. She saw merchants shouting, calling customers, making trades. For a moment, fear gripped her. What if she failed? What if no one bought from her? But then she remembered who she was. She was not the helpless girl who had been sold into slavery. She was not the weak child Fadima had abandoned. She was Nalita, and she was meant for more. Taking a deep breath, she approached a customer. She spoke with confidence, just as Elder Mazinga had taught her. She described the rich aroma of the spices, the beauty of the beads, the fine quality of the cloth. And to her surprise, people listened. By the end of the day, she had sold everything. When she returned to Elder Mazinga, she placed the coins in his hand, her face glowing with pride. He only smiled. "Now you understand," he said. "Wealth is not given. It is built." From that day forward, Nalita dedicated herself to learning and growing. She expanded her trade, buying and selling goods, making wise deals, and earning the respect of other merchants. She learned to read and write, keeping records of her business. She traveled to different towns, building connections, understanding markets. The years passed, and her wealth grew. She was no longer the girl who had been sold like an object. She was now a powerful trader, a woman of influence, a name that people spoke with admiration. One day, as she stood in her grand shop, overlooking the bustling market, she realized something. She had risen from the ashes. She had taken the pain of her past and turned it into power. And though she had everything she could ever want, there was still one thing left to do. It was time to face the woman who had once betrayed her. Fadima had spent years enjoying a life of comfort and power. With Chief Tabo under her control, she had everything she ever wanted: wealth, influence, and a household that bent to her every command. But greed is a dangerous thing, and Fadima's hunger for more would soon be her undoing. When Chief Tabo's health began to decline, Fadima pretended to care, but in reality she was counting down the days. She had no love for him, only for his wealth. She believed that once he was gone, everything he owned would belong to her. She imagined herself ruling the household with no one to question her. But fate had other plans. Chief Tabo's illness worsened, and the village elders gathered. His final days were filled with regret. He had ignored the whispers about his wife's cruelty, dismissed the uneasy feeling in his heart about Nalita's disappearance. And now, as he lay weak and frail, he saw the truth. Fadima had only ever loved his wealth, not him. With his last breath, Chief Tabo made a decision that no one expected. He called the elders and made it clear Fadima would not inherit everything. Instead, his wealth would be managed by the village council, distributed among the people, and protected from greedy hands. When the news reached Fadima, she was furious. She screamed, cried, and threatened everyone in the household. "This is mine," she shouted. "Everything belongs to me." But her words held no power anymore. The moment Chief Tabo passed away, the truth about Fadima started to surface. The servants she once mistreated abandoned her. The villagers who had feared her now ignored her. Those she had once manipulated turned their backs on her. Without Chief Tabo's protection, she was nothing. And then came the worst blow. Debts she had hidden for years began to surface. She had secretly stolen from the household, using Chief Tabo's name to fund her lavish lifestyle. Now, with him gone, those debts fell squarely on her shoulders. One by one, the things she once possessed were taken from her: her jewelry, her fine clothes, her grand house. She tried to fight back, to demand what she believed was hers, but no one listened. The same people who had once bowed to her now watched as she lost everything. Soon, Fadima had nothing left. No wealth, no servants, no power. She had spent years stepping on others to climb to the top, but now she was at the bottom, alone and forgotten. With nowhere to go and no one to help her, she was forced to wander the streets, begging for scraps. The woman who once looked down on everyone was now at the mercy of the same people she had mistreated. But fate was not done with her yet, because the one person she would soon have to beg from was the very girl she had betrayed. Nalita had not set foot in her old village since the day she was torn from her home and sold like an object. The memories of betrayal and pain had long been buried beneath the life she had built. But now, standing at the edge of the familiar dusty roads, she realized how much she had changed. She was no longer the helpless girl Fadima had discarded. She was a woman of power, wealth, and respect. Her arrival did not go unnoticed. Merchants and villagers turned their heads, whispering in awe as they saw the elegant woman stepping out of a grand carriage. Dressed in fine fabrics and adorned with the jewelry of a successful trader, she looked nothing like the girl they once knew. But Nalita had not come for recognition or revenge. She had come to see the village that once shaped her and to offer help to those in need. As she walked through the busy marketplace, she saw how much had changed. Some familiar faces had aged, children had grown, and new merchants had taken their place in the stalls where she had once played as a child. But what caught her attention was a frail, ragged woman crouched by the roadside, her hands trembling as she reached out to passing strangers, begging for a few coins. Nalita's steps slowed. Her heart pounded as she took in the sunken cheeks, the worn-out clothes, the hopeless eyes of the beggar woman. It took only a moment for her to recognize the person before her, Fadima. The once powerful woman who had ruled over Chief Tabo's household with cruelty and greed was now reduced to nothing. Her fine clothes had been replaced with tattered rags. Her sharp voice was now a pitiful whisper, and the arrogant fire in her eyes had faded into desperation. But Fadima did not recognize Nalita. To her, Nalita was just another wealthy stranger, someone who might have pity on her suffering. She stretched out her hands, her voice weak and pleading. "Please, kind lady, spare a few coins for a hungry woman." Nalita's breath caught in her throat. The woman who had once sold her into misery was now at her feet, begging for mercy. The irony of the moment was almost unbearable. If fate had wanted to deliver justice, it had done so in the most poetic way possible. Nalita could have walked away. She could have ignored Fadima, just as Fadima had ignored her cries for help all those years ago. But instead, she stood there, looking down at the woman who had shaped her past, wondering if she should reveal the truth or let fate take its course. Fadima sat on the dusty roadside, her hands trembling as she reached out to the wealthy woman standing before her. She had spent years living in misery, reduced from a powerful woman to a mere beggar. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, and her throat was dry from endless pleading. Every day she begged strangers for help, and most of them ignored her, just as she had once ignored the suffering of others. But this woman, there was something different about her, the way she carried herself, the kindness in her eyes. Fadima clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, this stranger would take pity on her. "Please, my lady," she whispered, her voice weak. "Just a little food, a small coin, anything." Nalita's heart pounded in her chest as she looked at the woman who had once caused her so much pain. The last time they had seen each other, Fadima had been dressed in the finest silks, dripping in gold, looking down at Nalita, as if she were nothing more than an inconvenience. And now, here she was, tattered, broken, powerless. Fate had delivered its justice. But was it enough? Instead of revealing herself, Nalita decided to test Fadima, to see if time had changed her heart. She knelt slightly, meeting the old woman's tired eyes. "Tell me, old mother," she said gently, "how did you end up here? Where is your family, your children?" Fadima let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "I had everything once," she muttered. "A fine house, wealth, respect, but it was all taken from me." Her eyes glistened with tears. "My husband died, and those who once bowed to me turned their backs. They took everything, left me with nothing." Nalita waited, wondering if Fadima would speak the full truth, but she didn't. She never mentioned Nalita, never admitted what she had done all those years ago. Even in her suffering, she still chose to paint herself as a victim. Nalita's chest tightened. It seemed Fadima had learned nothing. She reached into her pouch and pulled out a gold coin, letting it glimmer in the sunlight. "If you were given a second chance," she asked, "would you live differently? Would you be kind to those who once depended on you?" Fadima's eyes widened at the sight of the coin. She nodded quickly. "Yes, of course. If only I had another chance, I would be generous. I would be kind." But there was something in her voice, a hint of desperation rather than sincerity. Nalita studied her for a moment. The woman before her was not sorry for what she had done. She was only sorry for where life had left her. And that was the true punishment. Fadima had spent years treating others like nothing, and now she was the one being ignored and discarded. She had sold Nalita for her own selfish gain, believing the girl would disappear forever. But life had its own plans. Taking a deep breath, Nalita knew it was time. She had seen enough. The truth was about to be revealed, and Fadima would soon learn the most painful lesson of all. Nalita took a deep breath, steadying herself. The moment had come. She had given Fadima a chance to show remorse, to admit her mistakes. But the woman had only played the victim. Now, it was time for the truth to be known. She turned to the crowd that had begun to gather. Curious eyes watched, villagers whispering among themselves. They had seen Fadima beg for years, but they had no idea who the wealthy woman standing before her truly was. Nalita's voice was calm but firm as she spoke. "You say life was unfair to you, that people took everything from you. But tell me, Fadima, do you remember the girl you sold?" Gasps rippled through the crowd. Fadima froze, her face draining of color. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Nalita stepped closer, her eyes never leaving the woman who had once betrayed her. "Years ago, you sold a child to a stranger, throwing her away as if she were nothing. That girl suffered, but she survived. She built a life for herself, a life you never imagined she would have." She let her voice rise, letting the weight of her words settle over the crowd. "That girl was me." The villagers erupted in shock. People turned to each other, whispering in disbelief. Some shook their heads, others stared at Fadima with disgust. They had always known she was a cruel woman, but this was beyond anything they had expected. Fadima stumbled backward, her body trembling. "No, this can't be," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. Nalita did not flinch. "You thought I would disappear forever, but fate had other plans. And now, you stand before me, begging for the very kindness you never showed me." The weight of humiliation crashed down on Fadima. The villagers who had once feared her now looked at her with pity and scorn. Murmurs filled the air. She sold a child? No wonder she lost everything. This is her karma. Fadima's legs gave way, and she collapsed onto the dusty ground. Tears streamed down her face, but she knew no amount of weeping could undo what she had done. The world had finally seen her for what she truly was. Nalita stood tall, watching the woman who had once tried to destroy her. Justice had been served, and for the first time in her life, Fadima had no power, no wealth, and no lies to hide behind. Nalita stood in the center of the crowd, her heart pounding. The villagers watched in silence, waiting for her next move. Fadima knelt before her, broken and humiliated, her once proud face streaked with dust and tears. This was the moment Nalita had once dreamed of, the moment when justice would be served, when Fadima would feel the same helplessness she had inflicted upon others. But now that it had arrived, Nalita felt no satisfaction. She had power over Fadima, but what would she do with it? She could cast her out, let her suffer alone, just as Fadima had done to her. She could ensure that Fadima never escaped the life of misery she had created for herself. Yet deep inside, Nalita knew that revenge would not change the past. It would not erase the nights she had cried herself to sleep, the pain of being sold like an object, or the years of struggle she had endured to build herself back up. It would only keep the cycle of cruelty alive. The crowd whispered among themselves. Some expected Nalita to banish Fadima from the village, to make her suffer even more. Others wondered if she would have her thrown into the hands of the authorities for her crimes. Nalita looked down at Fadima, who clung to her feet, sobbing. "Please," Fadima whispered, her voice shaking. "I have nothing left. Show me mercy." Nalita took a deep breath. Then, in a voice that was clear and strong, she said, "I forgive you." Gasps filled the air. Even Fadima looked up in disbelief, her tear-streaked face frozen in shock. "But," Nalita continued, her tone firm, "forgiveness does not mean I will take you under my care. You will not live in my house, you will not share in my wealth, and you will not undo what has already been done. I release you from my heart, but your fate is still your own." Fadima trembled. She had expected hatred, expected punishment, but forgiveness. It was a kindness she had never given, and now she did not know how to accept it. Nalita turned away. She had made her choice. Mercy did not mean forgetting, and it did not mean carrying the weight of someone else's mistakes. She had freed herself from hatred, but Fadima would have to live with the life she had created, and that, Nalita knew, was the true punishment. Fadima sat in the dust, her body trembling with exhaustion and shame. The villagers had turned away from her, whispering among themselves, their eyes filled with scorn and pity. She had once ruled over them, walking through the village with pride, dressed in the finest clothes, her voice carrying authority. But now she was nothing. No home, no power, no one to manipulate. She had begged Nalita for mercy, hoping to be taken in, to be given a second chance at the comfort she had once enjoyed. But Nalita had only given her forgiveness, not a place in her life. And in that moment, Fadima realized that forgiveness did not mean salvation. She would still have to suffer the consequences of her own actions. With no other choice, she wandered through the village, hoping someone would take pity on her. But doors that once opened for her now remained shut. The same people she had looked down upon now avoided her gaze. The few who spoke to her reminded her of the past, of how she had mistreated others, how she had used people for her own gain. Days turned into weeks, and Fadima learned what it truly meant to be powerless. She scrounged for food, begged for scraps, and slept in the cold. Hunger gnawed at her bones, and every passing day became a battle for survival. She had spent her life chasing wealth and control, but in the end, all she had left was regret. Meanwhile, Nalita's name spread far beyond the village. She was no longer the helpless girl who had been sold like an object. She was now a powerful merchant, respected and admired by many. She had built her own empire, not through cruelty, but through wisdom, kindness, and determination. As she left the village, she walked with her head held high, her dignity untouched. She had not sought revenge, yet fate had delivered justice in its own way. She had proven that true power did not come from destroying others. It came from rising above the past and forging a future of success. And as she disappeared into the horizon, Fadima watched, knowing that she had lost not just wealth, but the one thing she had never valued, love. And now it was too late to get it back. Life has a way of bringing justice in the most unexpected ways. Fadima thought she could betray an innocent girl, sell her off like an object, and live a life of luxury without consequences. But fate had different plans. The very child she abandoned rose to greatness, while she was left to beg for mercy. This story teaches us a powerful lesson. No matter how strong evil may seem, it will always crumble under the weight of its own greed. Nalita could have taken revenge, but she chose dignity over hatred. She proved that success is the greatest form of justice. Sometimes walking away with your head held high is far more powerful than destroying your enemies, because in the end, karma never forgets. If this story touched your heart, if it made you feel the weight of destiny and the power of forgiveness, then don't keep it to yourself. Like this video, share it with your loved ones, and let them witness this emotional journey. And if you love inspiring stories like this, subscribe to our channel for more. Thank you for being part of this journey. Your support means everything.